Hello everyone. Razorblade Mango here. And it is time. It is time to talk about my most highly anticipated game of 2023. You all know what it is. Final Fantasy XVI, which is published, of course, by Square Enix, developed by their own in-house studio, Creative Business Unit 3. It's a terrible name. I really wish they would change that developer name, but it is what it is. Of course, this is the development team that is normally led by Naoki Yoshida, who of course is famous for doing a complete reversal of fortune on Final Fantasy XIV Online. And this is one of the main reasons that I was really excited for Final Fantasy XVI. Outside of the fact that I am a big fan of the series, I grew up playing the games, some of them. The big ones are 7, 9, 10. Those are the big ones from my childhood. And I was really excited to see what Naoki Yoshida and his team could bring to the table when working on a single-player mainline Final Fantasy game. And I've been especially keen on it because I've always been on the outside looking in when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV. Because I'm not an MMORPG guy. I look at Final Fantasy XIV and I just feel totally out of my depth, totally intimidated, even though I'm well aware that the community is extremely welcoming and very nice, very kind to new players. I've heard plenty of times from Naoki Yoshida as well that it's possible to play 14 in all single player. I don't have to team up with a bunch of people. Just looking at it, I've always just felt too intimidated to even try, and I don't really want to pay a subscription for the game. So 16 I felt like was the best I'm gonna get for a game where they take the ideas that they have at the cornerstone of 14 and apply them to 16, while also of course designing it around a single player aspect. And I think the game has everything going for it. It had Naoki Yoshida at the helm, it's got the 14 team, it's got the battle director from Devil May Cry 5, which is a fantastic game, and it's got Soken as well, who's the composer for 14, who I like quite a bit. So, how did I feel about Final Fantasy XVI? After, it says on the PlayStation that I spent 78 hours with this game, which I don't think is actually accurate, considering I think the PS5 clock overblows how much time I've put into it. So I'm gonna subtract a couple hours from that and say that I've put roughly 75 hours into Final Fantasy XVI. And that includes a full playthrough of the main story, that includes completing all the side quests, completing all the hunts, dabbling a little bit into the harder Final Fantasy mode that unlocks after the main campaign. And this is frustrating for me because I finished Final Fantasy XVI and I came away from it feeling a lot more divided than I expected. I never had a problem with the fact that it was going to be just a pure action game where they really downscale a lot of the RPG elements of it. I am fine with that. I'm not a Final Fantasy purist. I'm fine with the games taking chances as far as different styles, different combat mechanics. But the key word that I think describes Final Fantasy XVI perfectly is inconsistent. This is a very inconsistent game. Lots of peaks and valleys in nearly every single aspect of it. Inconsistency plagues this experience. And actually, Doggy Bone Gaming, who's a personal friend and friend of the channel, I think even without him playing the game, he described Final Fantasy XVI perfectly. Because we were talking over Discord about a week after it came out, and he asked me what I thought of the game so far, and I basically gave him this wishy-washy answer because I wasn't sure how to exactly word how I was feeling about the game. But he responded with this, and I'm paraphrasing him a little bit. He responded with, "The way you're describing it, it sounds like an anime that has a lot of boring filler, but the episodes with the epic story moments and payoff make it still worth going through." And that is exactly right. That That describes Final Fantasy 16 to a T. It is an anime that has a lot of boring filler, a lot of downtime, a lot of boring downtime. But when it finally gets to those moments that you've been waiting for, the payoff is extraordinary, and it really carries the experience. It carried me through hours of just nonsense filler in this game. That's pretty much how I feel about Final Fantasy 16 in general. It's just up and down, up and down, up and down. That is the experience of it. I guess I'll start with what I think is one of the strongest elements of the game, which is the story. So after the disaster of a story that Final Fantasy 15 had, it was a relief when I realized that the story in 16 would be far more compelling and structurally coherent. It feels like a story. What a novel concept. It feels like a story that was thoughtfully crafted over a few years, rather than some Frankenstein's monster of a mess where they're just bolting on shit. They're throwing shit out that Nomura came up with, and then they're putting in this original stuff but stapling it to the old concept, and then taking things that are meant to be in the story and divvying up into different forms of media and DLC. It's not like that at all. The Naoki Yoshi-P, he was not kidding when he said that you don't need to read or watch anything else to understand the story in 16 and receive a compelling experience. You don't need to go to any outside media in order to get the character development you expect from the game itself. This isn't 15, thank Christ, where you need to watch the fucking anime, rent the movie, buy the DLC packs, read some books to understand the full story. No, it's all here in 16, and that is awesome. And thank God it is a compelling story filled with really good characters, some amazing story moments, some of the best cinematics that Square Enix has ever created. This is some high level production value here as far as the story. This stuff is awesome. Unfortunately, there are some bumps in the road, and while I think most aspects of the story are great, if I had one of my major complaints about the story is that I think it borrows a little too much from Game of Thrones, where it has a really obvious Game of Thrones influence. And that normally, if they stuck with it the entire game, I think that could have been interesting. But I felt like the obvious Game of Thrones influence that's much more present in the first third of the game doesn't really mesh all that organically with the usual Final Fantasy tropes that it focuses on during the rest of the game. There comes a point about a third into the story where it kind of forgets that it's trying to go for Game of Thrones' flavor, and it's like, oh, never mind, we have to make it a Final Fantasy game. And it's like, guys, choose one or the other. This blend of both doesn't really work out. And one of the things I'm not really crazy about it with having this Game of Thrones influence is that it becomes predictably miserable in certain scenarios, where this is actually one of my issues with Game of Thrones, is that because it's so miserable, because it's so proud of itself for its brutality and how violent it is and how sad and depressing it can get and how fucked up it can be at times, it gets predictable. Where you encounter, let's say, a group of villagers, and my immediate first thought when I saw this group of villagers was, oh, how long is it going to take until these villagers are all brutally slaughtered? And sure enough, it happens. When you're introduced to some characters, it's like, oh, how long is it going to be until these characters are just wiped out, tortured, whatever? And after a point, it happens. It becomes kind of predictable in the Game of Thrones way that I have a problem with. And this game is also divided into 3 segments, and some are definitely much longer than others, where you have Clive in his teens, is the main character, Clive in his teens, his 20s, and his 30s, and there are various time jumps between the 3 points. The time jumps always felt off. It always felt like there was stuff that was missing that I felt like they really could have explored in between those time jumps that would have helped the character development, that would have helped the storytelling, the pacing a little bit. And that's to me, those feel like missed opportunities. And there's especially one time jump that's really jarring that almost feels like, in a way, even though things have progressed in the world, I get the sense that the world hasn't really progressed all that much. It's a really weird conflict that I have with it in that time jump in particular. And I'm not going to go into any further details just because it risks spoiling stuff, but I wasn't really crazy about the time jumps that the game does. I feel like other games in the Final Fantasy series have done this time jump stuff better. And like I said, while I think it misses some opportunities here and there, it's mainly very enjoyable. It's honestly, the storytelling is one of the big things that kept me going when things were getting really bad quality-wise. More on that later. But as far as the characters go, shout out to Clive, man. I mean, you look at this guy, right? The first time I saw Clive, I was like, oh, it's another emo-ass Final Fantasy protagonist. It's like, okay, he's just some like generic looking guy. But no, I was very, very pleasantly surprised by how much I loved Clive as a protagonist. He is awesome. And he is a badass with a really violent, rough edge to him, but he can also be kind and gentle and compassionate. And he reminds me a lot of Geralt from The Witcher. He's got that kind of charming gruffness to him. When he makes decisions as a leader and he presents himself as one, I believed it 100%. I looked at Clive and I thought, oh yeah, if I was one of these guys that was with him, one of the party members, I would follow this guy into battle too. Because he just has that aura of competency and leadership and strength, but also, you know, compassion. And all of this is dramatically helped by Ben Starr's performance, which I thought long and hard about this. And this is gonna sound really, now that I'm thinking about it, you know, fuck hesitancy, I'm going for it. Ben Starr's performance as Clive in this game is the best performance I have ever seen in the Final Fantasy series. It's an incredible performance. I think he gives the best performance I've seen in a video game in years. He absolutely slays this part. And there are some moments where he has to be like really like dramatic and broken, and the way he's able to command this performance, it almost brought tears to my eyes at a couple points. And it's really hard to do a voice performance where you have to sound like you're broken up and sad and on the verge of like tearing up and crying and wailing, and it's hard to do that without sounding hokey, without it sounding kind of embarrassing, like you're trying way too hard. But Ben Starr, he does such an amazing job with both the really emotional moments and the quieter moments. It's a remarkable performance. This, like I said, if this guy, I really don't give a fuck about the Game Awards or whatever that shit, but if Ben Starr doesn't get nominated and win for this performance, fuck the Game Awards. Fuck that shit. Fuck who's ever voting in that shit. They suck. They don't understand talent when they see it. And I really highly doubt another performance is going to come by at some point during this year that's going to be better than Ben Starr's in this game. It's incredible. Shout out to Ben Starr. Holy shit. I could gush about his performance all fucking day, but we have other characters to talk about. Thankfully, this game has a really good cast of side characters. My personal standouts among the supporting cast are Sid, who's voiced by Ralph Ineson, who naturally has an awesome sounding voice. I think this might be my favorite Sid in the game. There's Benedicta, who is one of the icons, who's voiced by Nina Indes. She's awesome. I don't think she's in the game enough, unfortunately, but I loved her performance. And Dion, who outside of Clive and Sid is probably my favorite character in the game, and he's voiced by Stuart Clark. And this is also one of my favorite groups of villains in the series. And it was really refreshing and, again, a relief to find out throughout the game that I would actually be getting to spend a lot of time with each of the characters, each of the villains that they show in one of the opening cutscenes. Like, I compare that to Final Fantasy XV's opening villain cutscene where all the big bads in the game are having this meeting. And normally in a more competently presented story, when you're showing a group of villains together in the beginning, it's kind of an assumption that you're going to be spending time with them throughout the game. You know, Kingdom Hearts does this in the beginning with all the Disney villains when they're hanging out in Hollow Bastion. And 15, for whatever reason, doesn't do that. It doesn't matter. 16 does it. And when you see all the villains presented in one sitting, you can take comfort in the fact that you're going to be spending time with them. You'll get to know each and every one of them. And almost all of them, I think, are really good group of villains. And everything is helped by exceptional voice acting. And even outside of Ben Starr, who I think is the standout of the game, there is not a single bad performance in this game. And I think this has the very best voice acting in the series. And this is one of my exceptions that prevents me from saying every element of Final Fantasy XVI is inconsistent. Which, speaking of which, let's get into what I ultimately think is the main issue with the game, or at least the section where most of my main issues with the game lie, which is the design and the pacing. So, I think, after spending a lot of time with this game, I think the big flaw that affects this area, and a lot of areas in the game, is that the game is simply way too long. And I know you're thinking, oh my god, it's a Final Fantasy, it has to be long. And naturally, I don't have a problem with that. Naturally, I don't have a problem with long games if they're good. If a game is able to maintain a high quality experience throughout the whole fucking thing, then I don't mind a lengthy playtime. Hell, Persona 5 Royal took like a crazy ass 120 hours to finish the main story. And it's one of my top 10 games of all time. I fucking love Persona 5 Royal. Unfortunately, and this is where Final Fantasy XVI suffers, it suffers from a total lack of quality consistency. And what I think happened was that I think Creative Business Unit 3 had enough really good material, for a really fun and tight 25 to 30 hour game. However, because it's a mainline Final Fantasy game, and modern AAA publishers have this obsession with length, Square Enix felt the need and pressure to artificially extend the length. So they unfortunately filled the time between key story moments with some of the most boring crap I've played in recent memory. I have a seriously hard time believing that some of this stuff that's in the main story that cannot be skipped was designed with fun in mind. It really does feel like it was just designed just to pad out the length, which sucks. And this game takes a massive drop in quality in between the big combat encounters and just fucks up the entire flow of the game. And like I said earlier, it can zigzag from great to awful to great again to awful again and back and forth in the span of hours. And it's just, this is a problem that is particularly noticeable during the second act of the game. And the utterly dreadful pacing and quality inconsistency makes getting through it a chore. There were points where I was literally nodding off because I was so bored during certain parts of this game. I had to push myself to get through parts of it. I had to promise myself that it will get better. And there came a point, and I don't say this lightly, there came a point where I seriously considered dropping the game and watching the rest of the cutscenes on YouTube. That's when it was at its very worst. Yes, it was that insufferable. And the problem is that there's just this massive disconnect between what it's having you do in the big story moments that are actually cool and then the stuff in between. So I am this fucking badass with a giant array of powers and abilities. Why the hell am I being tasked to go on a bunch of fucking boring as shit fetch quests? Why? Why am I being tasked to go find a flower or to run errands for some smart-ass teenager or fuck off to some area to pick up some fucking sand? Go have some other schmuck pick up the fucking sand. I am a badass. I'm a fucking badass with all these powers. Why am I being sent off to bumfuck nowhere to pick up some fucking sand for an hour? Why? Why is this game making me do this? And I completely understand the need to have downtime in between the much crazier moments. I get it. I get it. This game cannot have its foot on the fucking pedal at top speed the entire 25 to 30 hour experience. I get it. I understand. Or 25 hour main story. 25 to 30 hour main story. Well, I get it. That does not mean downtime has to be fucking boring as shit. And the sad part is that, like I mentioned earlier, I really do. I think there is enough good material here for a 25 to 30 hour game. Maybe not an amazing game, but something that would have been much more to my liking from a structural and pacing perspective. And it reminds me a lot of the line from Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring, where Bilbo tells Gandalf that he, quote, feels like butter scraped over too much bread. And that describes Final Fantasy XVI perfectly. But when the game finally gets to a giant set piece moment, that's when it shines extremely brightly. This game goes so fucking hard with the spectacle and scale at a few points that I literally had my jaw open while I was playing during some of these parts. That's how good it was. It reminded me a lot of stuff like Bayonetta, Asura's Wrath, Dragon Ball Z. It is insane, some of the spectacle in this game. And I can't even imagine how many man hours were spent constructing some of these set pieces. And I kept, some of the very best moments of the game, I literally kept saying out loud, holy fucking shit. Holy shit, during some of the game's very best moments. And that includes, thankfully, the final stretch of the game. Like, the final hour of the game, that is one of the most satisfying finales I have seen in a game in a long time, as far as the final boss and everything. It's incredible. And my god, this game has some of the most visually impressive boss fights I've ever seen. The icon fights, that is clearly where the majority of the effort went as far as the production. The icon fights are far and away the highlights of the game. There's only one that I didn't really particularly like because it goes on for too long and the music during its second phase is lame, but the icon fights in this game, where it's these giant, you know, the creatures that you've known throughout the series, the summons. So you get to watch shit like Ramu and Ifrit and Shiva, like all these characters that you've known throughout these games. They get to fight, they clash like a fucking even crazier version of Godzilla versus King Kong, shit like that. These icon fights are literally the giant epic battles I used to imagine with my friends when I was in elementary school. Whenever we would play games together, this is the kind of shit that I envisioned. And I love that we have reached a point in video games where my childhood imagination can be brought to life before my very eyes. Just holy shit, these icon fights are damn, they are good. Damn. But unfortunately, going back to the negative, another huge issue I have with this game is I think the thing that it's gotten slammed for the most, which are the side quests, which are mostly boring as shit. The overwhelming amount of lousy side quests is becoming a consistent problem with big Final Fantasy games nowadays. Final Fantasy 15 and 7 Remake had plenty of dull side quests, but the sheer number of them in 16 just to provide nebulous content was a big mistake. There are maybe 3 good ones during the first act. I don't know about good, maybe just okay. And then some very good ones near the end. And I'm talking the very end. But the vast majority of the side quests feel like they were written by a D-tier team of writers. It was like they put in typical JRPG side quests into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT shit these out, and they were like, perfect, and just slapped them into the game. And what sucks is that there are some side quests that are actually really good and do provide both, meaningful storytelling moments and some great rewards and upgrades, but they're so few and far between. And even the writing for most of those is not very good. And there came a point too where I started, I'm not ashamed to admit it, I started skipping dialogue during some of the worst ones, because I couldn't give less of a fuck about what I was doing and why I was doing it. The overabundance of side quests that are dull fetch quests are where it's blindingly obvious that an MMORPG team made this game. And another thing that really sucks too is that some of the side quests I feel like should have been swapped out for some of the more boring main story moments, because some of the worst moments in the main story feel like D-tier side quests, but they're not skippable. And yet some of the best moments in the game that, help make main story moments more meaningful and provide some of the best upgrades are skippable, are missable. It boggles my mind that's a thing. I guess they have to find some way to incentivize doing these fucking side quests, but couldn't you maybe incentivize them by just scaling down the quantity of them and making them much better written, make each one just that much better, rather than just shitty ass fetch quests? Oh, go find this, go find that, go kill this enemy, go kill that. God damn, these side quests, most of these fucking suck. The best side activity, though, by a country mile, is hunting down the notorious marks, because the game just shuts the fuck up and sets you loose against a super powerful enemy. But even those feel like a missed opportunity, because most of the marks are just recycled enemies from the main story, including the big S-rank ones. And I was really hoping that the S-rank hunts would bring some new enemies to the table and bring some kind of truly wild and challenging fights. I was like super crazy powerful at that moment when I started doing those S-rank ones. I wanted more of a challenge. But by the time you're strong enough to fight them, almost all of them are just a breeze, because you've encountered these enemies the entire game and you know how to beat them. Even if they have like one extra move. Oh wow, they have one extra move. Big fucking deal. Even the strongest mark in the game isn't too bad, and I was able to beat him on my first try. And another little nitpick I have with the hunts is that the music that plays during these fights is the exact same track every time. It's the same battle theme from most of the overworld. And it's the same even when fighting the S-rank guys. So they don't create any new track or unique music for the S-rank fight. So it just doesn't feel any more different or intimidating, which sucks. Again, big missed opportunity with that. So let's talk about another area that I have mixed feelings about, which is the gameplay. I think the combat is fine. Strangely enough, the combat reminds me, and the way your inventory is all set up, your accessories, and how many you can equip, it gives me a lot of Kingdom Hearts vibes, which is very weird. But the combat's okay. It's functional. It gets the job done. But outside of being flashy, I don't think it's really anything exceptional. And I think Skill Up, the YouTube reviewer, I think he said something that I thought was dead on when describing the combat. The combat has mechanical depth, but not a lot of strategic depth. Because while this game gives you a lot of different moves and elemental attacks to play around with, to experiment with, that doesn't really matter when you can employ the exact same strategy on pretty much every enemy in the game. And during the whole time, combat started to feel very samey throughout it. And what also doesn't help are the lack of Final Fantasy combat staples that would have given combat some more depth, such as afflictions, status weaknesses, party member management, no basic Final Fantasy tropes that would have made the experience better here. Yeah. One counterpoint I could see being raised, though, is that, somebody could say, well, Razorblade Mango, you love Kingdom Hearts, and Kingdom Hearts has, like, a very similar battle system, but you don't think the combat in that is, like, samey and flat. Yeah, but Kingdom Hearts, especially 1 and 2, have a lot more strategic depth to it, where you have to manage certain weaknesses that different fucking enemies have and stuff like that. And it's also shorter, so the combat doesn't wear out its welcome anywhere near the degree that Final Fantasy 16 kind of gets to that point. And as far as, enemies, for example, in Final Fantasy 16, when encountering a fire enemy, fire and ice attacks do relatively the same amount of damage. If there's any big difference between the two, it's like very negligible. It's totally unnoticeable. And I think it was a big mistake too to restrict the number of elemental sets that you can use to only 3. I get that they want to make you, they want to par back you being overpowered throughout the experience, but that also makes the managing the new powers a lot more annoying. And freely customizing your moves requires an unreasonable amount of grinding for a single playthrough. And all of this just puts a damper on the combat system when it's clearly being pushed as one of the stars of the show. Look, like I said, I'm not a Final Fantasy purist, so I don't care that it's an action game. I care that it's a shallow action game. And another big problem too is that enemy variety is pretty piss poor. By the second act, you will have fought so many of the same enemies that you will be sick of them. And I grew to hate some of these mini bosses, in particular this fucking giant axe wielding one, because of both how tedious he was to fight and how often he appeared in story battles. If I had taken a shot every time he showed up during the main story, I would have been dead before the game's midway point. That's how often they recycle enemies in this game. And look, it sounds like I'm shitting on the combat system, but I want to make it clear that I still think the combat is fun. When it basically turns into, a stripped down, like Kingdom Hearts or Devil May Cry, where I'm dodging and parrying enemies. Like, that stuff is fun. But it's disappointing because I wish the combat here was the hybrid system from Final Fantasy VII Remake, because I thought they finally hit upon something really special with that combat system. Because for a long time, Square Enix had been chasing this middle ground between a turn-based, traditional turn-based combat and pure action gameplay. And I felt like with the 7 Remake, they finally hit the nail on the head with the balance between the two. And I felt like they should just be using that combat system for future mainline Final Fantasy games until they can come up with something that's even better than that. And what sucks is that as far as the difficulty, normal difficulty, and it's the highest one that's available by default, normal doesn't feel challenging enough in the main story. And I dislike that the harder difficulty is locked behind New Game Plus. That sucks, especially if you want the much harder experience from the get-go. And as for the mode itself, the Final Fantasy mode, it's disappointing because while it touts, difficulty exclusive movesets from bosses and this bigger challenge and stuff like that, really all it does is just make the enemies a lot spongier. And that doesn't really solve any of the problems with the combat. It just makes it makes the game more tedious because you're just wailing on these fucking enemies for like many more minutes compared to how they are in the normal mode. And I only played maybe like a few hours of the Final Fantasy mode, and I was like, I've had enough, I'm good. So let's move on to another topic, the graphics, which this is another area where it's inconsistent. Graphics wise, Final Fantasy 16 I think ranges from okay at times to spectacular. Like I mentioned, a lot of the cinematic cutscenes, that is the stuff where it's clear that's where most of the money was spent. Because the giant moments of spectacle and the cutscenes, they look fantastic. And they contain some of the most striking imagery in the game. There's one image in particular where one of the villains the main characters are looking up at one of the main villains, and they're silhouetted against this dark sky looming down on the protagonist, and it was such an awesome shot, and it gave me like goosebumps looking at it. And paired with the music, I thought it was just an incredible moment. And it's small, but it reminded me a lot of the iconic shot from 7, where Sephiroth walks through the flames of Nibelheim, and it gave me that same sense of foreboding, and that's a huge compliment coming from me. But unfortunately, again, it's inconsistent because the environments you spend most of the time in are pretty forgettable. There's not really a lot of inspired art direction with the main environments that you're walking through. And what doesn't help too is that the color palette of the game when exploring, so the color palette in most of the environments works both in the game's favor and against it. So in exploration, like I mentioned, while I understand that the color palette gets more and more drab and colorless the longer the game goes for narrative reasons, it just doesn't make for a very appealing looking game when exploring the world. It makes me think my TV settings are all fucked up. On the other hand, in combat, especially during some of the more particle heavy moments, the cool thing that the drab color palette does when, being a background for like crazy spectacle in the foreground is that it gives the game a lot of visual clarity. Like for example, playing Horizon Forbidden West last year, I felt like that game was so over detailed to the point where it became messy as far as visually, because a lot of things in the foreground tend to blend in with the background, which makes visual clarity a big problem with that game, especially in the much more action heavy moments. And what's unfortunate too is that the performance here is a big disappointment, because again, it's wildly inconsistent. Where during combat, it's really good. The performance holds up. I mean, it's at like a nearly locked 60 frames from what I could tell with the combat. There are some dips here and there, but combat, thankfully, that's where it needed to get the performance right, and it succeeds in that area for the most part. I noticed that it takes a pretty big drop in image quality during these much more busy moments, especially during boss fights. So that was disappointing, but when you're exploring the open world and it's like chugging at like an inconsistent, it can like dip from anywhere to like 30 frames to 40 frames to 50 frames. It's just, performance sucks when exploring. And what didn't help too at launch is that it came with this ugly as hell motion blur that you couldn't turn off until about a month after launch. So you can turn it off now, but for that first month of playing the game, it was miserable whenever I had to like turn the camera in one of those like 30 frames parts of the game. It looked fucking hideous. It was like somebody slathered Vaseline all over my screen. Just super ugly. A complete disservice to the game's visuals. I don't know why that fucking ugly ass motion blur was there at launch. I don't know why you couldn't turn that off. Thankfully, an area that I think kind of makes up for the visual blemishes is the music, which of course the music is primarily composed by Final Fantasy XIV alumni Masayoshi Soken, and I'll be honest, I like Soken, but I've never really gotten it from 14. Like, I like the music to 14 from what I've heard. Maybe I would need to play the game to understand the context and everything that the music is coming from, but Soken to me, I know people love him, and this might be like a hot take for me. I don't think he's in the same league as like Shimomura. I don't think he's in the same league as Uematsu, obviously. But I think the soundtrack of Final Fantasy XVI is mostly great. I don't think every track hits, but the best tracks in the game are bangers that I've been bumping ever since I finished the game. And the moments where the music doesn't hit, I think there's like one industrial rock moment during one of the big icon fights. The music just wasn't good, and there's one like techno part during one of the boss fights, which is And I think the main area of my disappointment with the music is that I wasn't as crazy about some of the softer, more atmospheric compositions, which I think pale in comparison to what, like, again, Shimomura can bring to the table. But as far as like the combat music, that stuff is awesome. That I love most of the boss music in this game. It's really catchy. It gets your fucking heart racing, your blood pumping, and you are in there. You are in the thick of it, and you listen to that music, and when everything clicks, as far as the audiovisual presentation, when you're getting those moments as a pure spectacle, when the gameplay is working, when the performance is running well, when the music, the best music kicks in, Final Fantasy XVI is an immaculate experience. When everything is firing on all cylinders, when all of those things just line up really well, mwah, immaculate experience. Some miscellaneous things that I will go over before my overall thoughts. I really like the active lore journal that this game has. At no point in the game did I ever feel like I had to go online to research something. All the lore in the game is there in the game. And you get a lore master in your hideout, and when you go out and do missions, you can come back and talk to him, and certain lore bits will update. There's a map expert, a character. One of the things I love too is this character web where you can go through various timelines that the game goes through and see how relationships change between certain characters. I love that stuff. There's one, the big thing is the active lore journal, where at any point you can hit, I think it's holding down the touchpad on the PS5 controller, and it brings up this thing where it dynamically changes certain lore sections you can look up based on the cutscene that you're in, based on the moment of the story that you're in, and I loved that. I hope more games do this active lore journal. It feels like a very advanced version of Jiminy's journal from Kingdom Hearts. I must say that the emphasis on mature elements, I'd say is a bit of a mixed bag in my opinion. I was very surprised by how bloody the game is. I always think of Final Fantasy Type 0 when I think of a mature rated Final Fantasy game, or at least I did before 16 came out, where I've always said that the thing that I remember the most from Type 0, which I don't think is a good game, but I always remember the opening where it really sets the tone really well for how the game is going to go, because you get to watch a chocobo and its rider slowly bleed to death and die. And that is a great tone setter for a video game. Just that concept in general is a great tone setter for a Final Fantasy game. But my god, in like the opening few hours of Final Fantasy 16, like people are beheaded, like throats are slit, there's like gore. It's fucking bloody as shit. And again, there's this predictable misery to it with how violent it can be. But I never really thought the violence ever became like super excessive or a gore fest. It felt like it was just enough to sell you on the ugliness in most cases. There are some points where I think it's like, did that moment of violence really need to be there? Did we really need to do that? But like, I get it. It's mature. I get it. One of the more negative elements of the mature content, I thought, was the language, which this is going to sound strange coming from me, a guy who swears like a sailor, but I feel like a lot of the swearing in this game just felt unnecessary and excessive. It gets kind of silly after a while when Clive or one of the other characters will just say, fuck, before fighting a boss or before fighting some enemy or whatever. Like, it happens so many times during this game that it becomes comical. Like, there are multiple points where Clive will literally turn around and look at a boss and go, fuck. Or one of the other characters will look at something and go, oh, fuck. There's one part where he says, like, fuck, 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 like 3 times in a row. And it's like, yeah, I get it. I get it, game. You're trying to be mature. Trying to be M-rated. Thank you. I get it. And I know people will find this amusing as well, but I think the greater degree of nudity helps the game too, because it helps sell you on some of the relationships between the characters that I liked. There's one scene in particular where I think the scene would work a lot less without nudity, because it acts as an obvious, but it works. It acts as a good metaphor for like a visual representation of the emotional vulnerabilities that the characters are in the scene are expressing to one another. So I really liked that aspect, that element that nudity brought to the table. Moving on to the conclusion. After saying all of this, the strange thing about Final Fantasy XVI is that even though I just spent a bunch of time pointing out the game's deep problems and how divided I am on its elements, I still think this is the best mainline numbered Final Fantasy, single-player Final Fantasy game since 10. I don't count the remake games because those are their own separate thing in my head. And also, after some time pondering the game, my mind tends to fixate on the stuff it gets right a lot more than the stuff it gets wrong. And, you know, when I think about Final Fantasy 16, my mind immediately goes to, you know, its amazing boss fights, its beautiful music, the characters, the incredible voice acting, the ending. I would almost recommend this game just based on how fucking incredible the final act, the finale of the game is. Even with the big problems that I have, you know, I guess at the end of the day, it's like, like I said, I'm mixed on Final Fantasy 16, but I lean slightly more towards positive at the end of the day. And I would recommend it with some asterisks next to that recommendation. If they were to announce Final Fantasy 17 and say that Yoshi P and his team are working on it again, I would still be looking forward to it, even with my issues with 16. And at the end of the day, you know, I think if I'm leaning more towards positive when it comes to 16, then I'm content. I'm content with it. This is nowhere near the disaster that Final Fantasy 15 was. This is not at all a Final Fantasy 15 situation where that was such an outright, complete embarrassing disappointment that still hurts when I think about it today. But Final Fantasy 16, even with my issues with it, I would still recommend it with asterisks, with some big caveats. Thank you to everyone who watched. If you like what you see, subscribe. Let me know what you thought of Final Fantasy 16, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!